Hello my dear friends, how have you been? I'm Mari Thurger and today I'm going to talk about the heathen holidays of pre-Christian Scandinavia and the moon calendars as well as the cycle and the divisions of a year. So, it would seem that this year I have taken the opportunity to throw more wood into the fire, to feed the flames and enrage a lot of people. Well, enrage some people with historical facts. But in all honesty, I've been making videos for YouTube for about 3 years and some months now, and I've been measuring the type of audience that I have, which is quite diverse and from all sorts of backgrounds and cultures and very different sorts of people, which is absolutely wonderful. Most are here to exchange knowledge with me and I with you, and they are eager to learn. But I've noticed that there are a lot of misconceptions still going on in terms of paganism and conceptions of the gods and the celebrations and religious notions. And this year I took the opportunity to give you the facts and try to break some misconceptions as best as possible, of course. It's not entirely people's fault because, well, for the past 100 years or so, neo-paganism has been on the rise, but unfortunately, there were a lot of assumptions and misconceptions, and neo-paganism just started off as being either a paganization of Christianity or equating Christian beliefs to pagan ones and making an awful mixture. So, now, obviously, it's quite hard to try to give historical facts since now people are too used to the amount of gibberish that was given to us. So it's hard to accept the truth and the facts. You are not alone in this. I too have been obviously influenced by misinformation because, well, when you take your first steps into paganism, you have to start from somewhere, right? Now, on this video today, I shall clarify a few things, revise a few more, and even contradict some of my past works. Now, you may think that by contradicting myself, I've been lying to you in the past and I have some sort of agenda to control information and whatnot. But the thing is, it's actually a good sign when someone comes to you and openly says, "Hey, you remember that one thing I said in the past? Well, guess what? I was wrong." So here's what I came up with more detail and facts. So yeah, obviously, in the future I shall contradict myself once in a while and revise some of my past works and some of my claims, because that's how things are when it comes to history and especially with archaeology. New studies are always popping out, new ideas, new perceptions, new conceptions. And as you know, I'm not just an archaeologist, but I'm also a researcher. So naturally, I will find more information over time. And I'm always trying to keep as updated as possible. So indeed, it's only natural to once in a while contradict my past works and revise some things. My objective is to reach the truth as much as possible and not remain attached to obsolete ideas. And the first thing I have learned in archaeology, if anything, is that when you have an idea concerning something, it's always a plausible idea, always a possible scenario, as long as you have arguments and facts to defend your claim. So, with no more delay, let's get started, my dear friends. Please. When it comes to equinoxes and solstices among neo-pagans, it's always reason to celebrate, mostly because of the notion that our ancestors did it, rather than actually understanding the actual meaning of the changing of the seasons and the cycle of the year. Still, solstices and equinoxes almost make the entire basis of most neo-pagan religious manifestations, around the supposed wheel of the year and the 8 main celebrations. And then there is the idea that it was like this in all forms of paganism in different cultures in the past. This idea is mainly due to Wicca, which is one of the most famous neo-pagan religious manifestations, which has constructed this notion of a wheel of the year with important Sabbaths, and this was transported to almost every other neo-pagan religion. The same thing happened with and within neo-pagan religions based on some aspects of the Germanic pre-Christian cultural past. As you well know, the wheel of the year within Wicca is based on the solar calendar of Celtic and Gaelic paganism. And even among Celtic peoples all over the place, this wasn't as fixed as this with all these 8 major celebrations. Now, when Asatru came to be, the neo-pagan religion based on some aspects of pre-Christian Scandinavian beliefs, this idea of the wheel of the year was also transported into Asatru, which since the 70s of the past century, so no more than 50 years ago, people just took it as the indisputable truth that the ancient Nordic peoples also celebrated these 8 festivities, just like the Celts did it, and so on. In only 50 years, we forgot about everything we knew and accepted this. We are talking about people who made this up and are still alive and didn't yet went through the trouble to actually investigate the truth. And then when people start to take their first steps into paganism, they just swallow this. And like I said, I too have been a victim of this. When I took my first steps into paganism 17 years ago, I too thought that the Old Norse peoples had this wheel of the year, despite the fact that Celtic and Gaelic peoples did not worship or even knew about the Aesir, the Norse tribe of gods, which is the main focus within Asatru. But then, of course, there were eventually several branches sprouting from Asatru, and when the core is already corrupted, so to speak, the rest of the branches turn out to be twisted as well. So, in our modern times, more or less the past 20 years or so, Asatru and other likewise neo-pagan religious manifestations have accepted that there are, after all, 4 heathen holidays, which are the 2 solstices and the 2 equinoxes, even though the sources specifically demonstrate that there were only 3 main celebrations throughout the year in pre-Christian Scandinavia and nothing to do with equinoxes and solstices. But many more still maintain the belief that there were 8 celebrations in pre-Christian Scandinavia. These religious organizations didn't bother to express any historical evidences to back up their claims. As you know, Nordic calendars were governed by full moons. The year and its different periods of time were divided by the phases of the moon. Or at least the oldest surviving calendars show us that full moons after solstices and equinoxes marked important days in the calendar. The Germanic calendar was divided by cycles of the moon. That's where the modern English word month comes from moon, derived from moon. These months are not related to a particular moon, but to a cycle of the moon. So each month was a cycle of the moon. So, before Christianization, the calendars were not fixed solar months, which already gives us indications that solstices and equinoxes were not that big of a deal among ancient Germanic peoples. But we shall get to that, don't worry. Now, we have indications of winter nights, Yule, and Sigrblot, and midsummer, although the latter was not celebrated by Germanic heathens with a sacrifice, a blot, and it wasn't specifically understood as a holiday. There may have been midsummer celebrations, but it wasn't in a specific day, it wasn't a holiday. So we are really left with Winter Nights, Yule and Sigurblot, which are the three main holidays in pre-Christian Scandinavia. Now, Sigrblot comes in the sources, in various sources, but in the Eimskringla, to be more precise, it comes as the most important holiday of the Norse pagan. Take special notice at that. Not Yule, not Winter Nights, but Sigrblot was the most important holiday, which is somewhat equated with the Anglo-Saxon Hustru or Istra. Now, take special notice at this. Sigurblot and Hustru or Istra are often represented in the wheel of the year as Ostara. But as I've explained before, Ostara is a Wiccan Sabbath. Ostara is often mentioned as being a goddess in neo-paganism in general and in Wicca in particular. This is not supported in archaeology or any written source whatsoever. So, here we already see the Wiccanization of Asatru, when Sigurblot, the actual heathen holiday, was replaced by the Wiccan celebration of Ostara, which by itself, Ostara, has no historical evidences. And so we have this fervent belief that Ostara was a Norse goddess, a Germanic goddess in general. There's no mention of an Ostara anywhere, except for Jacob Grimm, who said he had found this goddess in Western Germanic folklore. But he is the only one who said this. This was probably his creation. And so he equated Ostara with the Anglo-Saxon Hustru or Istra, which led people to believe, to this day, that there was this general Germanic goddess of spring. There's no point in repeating myself, I think. The Anglo-Saxon Hustru or Istra, in the best case scenario, seems to have been a local deity worshipped and celebrated probably in southern ancient Britannia. Certainly not a general Germanic goddess of spring, right? Now, returning to the main holidays, Winter Nights, Yule and Sigurblot. In the 13th century, in written sources, we still have this strong idea around the three holidays. In the Ynglinga saga, to be more precise, in there it is specifically mentioned that on the first day of winter there should be a blot, a sacrifice, for a good year. And this is the Winter Nights. We shall get to it. And then, in the middle of winter, another sacrifice for a good crop. This is Yule. And the third blot, the third sacrifice, should be on Summer Day, a sacrifice called Victory Blot. Victory Blot is Sigrblot, a sacrifice to victory, a celebration to or for victory. Therefore, we have three major Norse blots a year, three sacrifices, three holidays. Now, let's develop each one of them as they come represented in several sources, in several sagas. The celebration of Winter Nights is the first celebration at the beginning of winter. It marks the beginning of winter. This celebration in the sources is also called Disablot and Hostblot, interchangeably. This also led to the belief that Disablot and Hostblot were either two different celebrations or the same but apart from Winter Nights. So just to make this clear, Winter Nights, Disablot and Hostblot are the same holiday, but they come with these different names in the sources, several sources. The name Disablot, most likely due to its religious character, a celebration focused on the Disir, the female spirits or spiritual entities of the land, both the land spirits, female ancestors, and the feminine in the divine sphere. It is, after all, a celebration for a good year, and this may be in reference to the agrarian cycle. So a good year of crops, fertility, plenty, successful agriculture, and husbandry in general. As the Vanir gods, Vanir deities, gods and goddesses of fertility, peace, and plenty were the most worshipped in Scandinavia, more than any other deity, as we take it from the great amount of place names derived from Vanir deities. Now, the name Hostblot is because Winter Nights was celebrated on the full moon of Asatru, roughly meaning harvest moon. which is the full moon closest to the autumnal equinox, but not an equinox celebration. Then, in the calendar comes Yule, which is the midwinter holiday. Everyone likes Yule, and this is by far the most celebrated holiday by all sorts of pagans, because, well, everyone was kind of used to celebrate Christmas before becoming pagan, so it's a chance to combining all festivities of this time, and we can all get along. But it might not be that simple after all, and that was actually, I think, the main purpose of bringing Yule into the winter solstice, the beginning of winter in the northern hemisphere, to get closer to the Christian celebration. But as you have noticed by now, for Old Norse people, winter didn't begin in the winter solstice at the 21st of December, but it began at the last full moon before the autumn equinox. There was no autumn to the Old Norse people. Our sense of autumn, fall, to them was the beginning of winter. So, again, in the Heimskringla, it says that the first night of Yule was, and I'll put the term right here, because frankly, I'm not going to try to pronounce that, but that means midwinter night. And Yule was held for 3 nights. So a 3 nights celebration, not one single holiday, but 3 days, it would seem. Now, we have to be careful with this, and Heimskringla is a very good historical evidence to trying to force Christianization upon the pagans already in the heathen past. Håkon I of Norway, the third king of Norway and ruling in the 10th century, was trying to force the heathens into Christianity. So it was he, King Håkon, who moved Yule to the same date as Christmas, which was then, at the 10th century, held on the solstice, on the Julian calendar, at December the 21st, not the 25th yet. The actual pre-Christian heathen Yule was a 3 days holiday, and that much seems to have remained the same, but it began on a full moon, not on a fixed solar date. Midwinter is the time of the 3 full moons after the full moon when winter began, and 3 full moons before the full moon when summer begins. Meaning that Yule was 3 full moons or 3 moon cycles after the harvest moon. The harvest moon being somewhere around late September or in October, so the celebrations were not in fixed days, but highly dependent on the cycle of the moon and the day of the full moon. So midwinter, the heathen Yule, was not halfway between the equinoxes on a fixed day of a solstice. By the phases of the moon, it was in January, most likely. In fact, one of the oldest evidences we have for a Scandinavian Yule celebration is a Byzantine source from the 6th century, making a reference to a celebration of midwinter by the Scandinavians after the winter solstice. So not before, not during the winter solstice, as we normally do nowadays in neo-pagan religious manifestations, but after the winter solstice. So point that out in your calendars, 3 full moons after the harvest moon. Point it to the full moon of January, but we shall get to that, don't worry. Now, I must admit that I was convinced that Yule was at the 21st of December, because it was pushed to be so since the 10th century of the Common Era, and neo-pagan religions reinforced that. And it turns out it wasn't. And I know this for about 6 or 7 years or so, but it was hard to digest. I've been processing this. Anyway, now, finally, we have Sigrblot, the beginning of summer, the first day of summer. We get from the sources that Sigurblot is a victory sacrifice, a holy day in celebration of victory. Sacrifices for victory due to the coming raiding and war season of summer. So it was a specific full moon that marked the beginning of summer as well. as we take it from the written sources of the 13th century that refer to the Sigrblot having been practiced by the heathens during a full moon, the first of summer. Now, as I said, this is somewhat equated to the Anglo-Saxon celebration of Asatru or Istra, which some have pointed out to be the origins of the Christian celebration of Easter. It is true that the Church doesn't date Easter to the equinox, but to the first Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox, which coincides somewhat with the supposedly Anglo-Saxon Easter celebration, perhaps. So it would make sense why Easter is celebrated in this way, after the full moon, following a lunar calendar, following the Anglo-Saxon celebration, maybe. However, this idea of an Easter or Istra celebration of the Anglo-Saxons comes to us from Bede, a Christian, the very person who fervently tried to eliminate the names of the heathen gods from the days of the week. This is not a case of the Christian Easter being placed in the same time of a pagan celebration or originating from a pagan celebration, but the other way around, more or less. This was Bede trying to push a very dubious Anglo-Saxon celebration into the Christian Easter to actually reinforce Christianity and push it onto the pagans. Bede comes up with this Asatru or Istra goddess and celebration, which, as I've said before, at the best case scenario, she may have been a local goddess of southern ancient Britannia. But let me explain. The Church still dates Easter this way today, not by the equinox alone, but by the full moon. Because Easter is neither Christian nor Anglo-Saxon pagan, but because Easter is a Jewish celebration brought into Christianity and then eventually passed on into the pagans. As I've said before, please watch this video right here, it's important. Now, Easter is still celebrated the week after the Jewish Passover, which is why it's a different day each year, because the Jewish calendar is lunar rather than solar. Lunar calendar like the Germanic peoples. Many ancient pagan societies, including European ones and of course non-European ones, conducted their lives based on lunar calendars. But in great part this was until the late Mesolithic. And most civilizations stopped using lunar calendars, which were in fact the oldest calendars, and only some cultural pockets here and there retained the habit of governing their lives through the phases of the moon, until quite late. We have the case of the Scandinavians, precisely, still during the early Middle Ages and well into the Viking period and late Viking period, conducted their lives through the phases of the moon. The counting of the seasons and the months, the celebrations, through the phases of the moon. But in general, solar calendars were adopted quite early in the Neolithic onwards, and this was greatly augmented precisely with the Roman Empire later on in the Iron Age. The fact that Easter is in a different day each year, indeed, it's due to its root based on a lunar calendar, but not pagan, but Jewish. Remember, not everything within Christianity is pagan, and not everything in neo-paganism is pagan either. Many ancient pagan peoples were celebrating all sorts of fertility aspects of life and celebrating spring, but they were not celebrating Easter specifically, not in a specific day. Easter is Christian with Jewish influence and not pagan. Again, I repeat, in the pagan past, all sorts of cultures and civilizations were celebrating spring and fertility aspects of the natural world. Most noticeable, of course, during this season, the season of spring, and the idea of rebirth as well as resurrection. But the celebration of Easter is not pagan after all. These mistakes often occur within neo-pagan religious organizations, precisely because such religious organizations prefer to remain ignorant and in the shadows, living the fantasies of the romantic political ideas of the 19th century, and relying on personal gnosis with zero historical evidences to back up their claims. So, what we are certain of is that the Scandinavian Sigrblot was at a full moon which marked their beginning of summer. And it may have nothing to do with the supposed dubious celebration of the Anglo-Saxon Uster or Istra, and certainly nothing to do with Easter. And when was this full moon? I'm not certain actually, but if we take into consideration that the winter nights were at the harvest moon and Yule was 3 full moons after this, so probably in January, maybe Sigrblot was 3 full moons after Yule, around April or May, and 3 moons after Sigrblot came midsummer, which may have been celebrated but not a holy day. There was no Norse ritual for midsummer, no celebration, no festivity generally performed by the Scandinavian Old Norse people, at least in the written sources. The 3 main celebrations, Winter Nights, Yule and Sigrblot, were public celebrations. Everyone participated in them. These were official holidays, so it is quite possible that aside from the Old Norse year being divided into 2 seasons, summer and winter, it was also probably divided into 4 quarters, 3 full moons each. The 3 most important celebrations marked a period of 9 full moons, and the number 9 was very important to the Old Norse people, as you well know it. Remember the celebrations at Old Uppsala, every 9 years for a period of 9 days, and the animals and human beings that were sacrificed in there were 9 of each species. And the great celebration of Sigrblot. And in the Heimskringla, again in Olaf's Saga Helga, to be more precise, it is specifically mentioned that in Sweden there was an old celebration when people were still pagans and they sacrificed at the full moon, a sacrifice for peace and victory for their king, and people from all over Sweden went there to Old Uppsala to celebrate this peace and victory celebration, which was Sigrblot. So, this is when midsummer comes in. Not a particular celebration actually, not a holiday either, as we have seen already, but midsummer is just that exactly, the middle of summer. 3 full moons after Sigrblot, which was the beginning of summer, and midsummer, middle of summer, that lies in the middle, just 3 full moons away from the winter nights, the beginning of winter. And this makes in total a year of 12 full moons, as the calendars show us that there were 12 full moons, or rather, the calendars were composed by 12 full moons. But of course, there were years with 13 full moons, and how the Old Norse people dealt with this, I'm not certain. Maybe the extra moon was added to one of the seasons, either in winter or either to summer. And in that case, on that specific special year, the 3 main holidays were pushed forward, and in that specific year of 13 full moons, the holidays were in different times than the years of 12 full moons. And as such, summer and winter in a 13 full moons year may have been seen as longer or shorter than the previous year, depending, of course, where the extra full moon was placed. The most common thing is to have 12 full moons, but after a succession of years, obviously there eventually comes a year with 13 full moons. So in these specific years, instead of a summer having 6 full moons and winter other 6 full moons, maybe summer would have 7 full moons and winter the 6 full moons, always making summer last longer for the raids and war. So, Winter Nights, Yule and Sigrblot were the actual holidays of the pre-Christian Scandinavians. Only these 3, and all historical evidences point to them. And what they have in common is that they all began at a full moon. So they were always shifting every year, and as such, these holidays were not celebrated on a fixed date. Midsummer, on the other hand, was not particularly celebrated, but was a marker in the 4 quarters of the year, 3 full moons each. Furthermore, the Scandinavian year was divided into 2 seasons and not 4, summer and winter, as you have probably noticed by now, or maybe I already said it, I don't remember. So, what have we learned today? We have learned that neo-pagan religious manifestations, especially Asatru and other likewise groups and organizations linked to some aspects of Germanic paganism, completely neglect Sigrblot, which was only the most important celebration among all Norse peoples, and was replaced by Ostara, which is exclusively a Wiccan Sabbath, and not at all based on actual historical evidences. We have also learned that the winter nights are rarely celebrated, and there is still a big confusion between Sigrblot and Ostblot, but that is perfectly understandable because they come in different sources, different written sources, different sagas even, and it isn't straightforward as to their meaning, but with a careful study and very tiresome study and very boring of the sources, we understand that winter nights, Sigrblot and Ostblot, are the same. And we have learned also that we modern pagans have been celebrating Yule in the winter solstice for far too long, when in fact we should have set our calendar to the phases of the moon and following its cycles and be attentive to the full moons, at least among heathens. Now, it's important to underline this. Håkon the Good, or Håkon I of Norway, in the mid-10th century of the Common Era, moved the original heathen Yule to be at the same time as Christmas, which was by that time, the 10th century, understood to be in the solstice. Mind that Christmas was on the solstice until the Julian calendar was rectified by the Gregorian calendar, 6 centuries after Håkon's time, in the 16th century. So Håkon I of Norway, when he moved Yule to the same date as Christmas, he was moving it to the solstice, the same date Christians celebrated Christmas at that time, at the 10th century. And this is very important because from that moment on, the 10th century onwards, the Scandinavian calendars start to have Yule on the solstice, especially Icelandic calendars thereafter. The Icelandic calendar after Christianization shows clear differences from the celebrations held in continental Scandinavia in pre-Christian times. For instance, as I've said, there were 3 main holidays in heathen times, Yule being one of them, which Håkon I, as I've said, moved to the solstice. And so in Icelandic calendars from the 10th century onwards, we have Yule at the winter solstice. And we see the celebration of Alfablot as well, on the full moon of November, more or less around that time. A celebration to the Olfar, the elves, an Icelandic celebration. And we also have the Icelandic celebration called Disting, and at the full moon of March, which has some parallels with the Sigrblot, but instead of being celebrated around September or middle October, it was passed on or moved to March in Iceland. Why is this? Probably because of the climate and geographical differences between Iceland and mainland Scandinavia, especially southern Scandinavia. And as such, in Iceland, the agrarian cycle must have been quite different, as winter is even longer and summers are less warm than in mainland Europe, in mainland Scandinavia. So the actual original pre-Christian Yule feast occurred at the first full moon after the first new moon following the winter solstice, which means Yule this year, 2020, was at the 10th of January, if I'm making my calculations right, since the last new moon after the winter solstice was at the 26th of December of 2019. So this is what we must take in mind. The importance here was to have Yule at the first full moon after the first new moon after the winter solstice. So maybe I must rectify what I said earlier about the 13th full moon as an extra moon of a year cycle. Perhaps placing this 13th full moon in the calendar depended on the Yule date. It seems, according to the sources, that the Yule celebration wasn't a fixed day, but it was fixed in the same in the sense, in terms of the phases of the moon, to be that specific full moon I have just mentioned. So the 13th full moon, an extra moon, would either be added or completely ignored to that year to have the next year's Yule on that specific full moon. So I repeat, remember, the Yule celebration, the original Yule celebration, is at the first full moon after the first new moon after the winter solstice. So, with this being said, what we have also learned is that modern heathenry, especially Asatru organizations, have been following the Wiccan wheel of the year. And not only that, but also following the same mindset and the very foundations of Wicca, neo-pagan religious assumptions, and bringing them into heathenry. So this begs the question, when it comes to heathenry, are these religious organizations really reliable? Well, not historically accurate, that's for sure. And for too long they have been passing down to us the same wrong notions, and instead of having paganism, we end up having paganizations of Christianity and or Wiccanizations of the pagan past. I'm not making any friends in here, am I? But well, just ask yourself if you truly want to practice and above all understand the paganism of the past, or if you want to stick with modern assumptions solely based on the most widespread monotheisms because they are deeply rooted in our collective consciousness, and certain neo-pagan religious organizations can't seem to move past that. Mind that I am in favor of spiritual evolution, and indeed I am a strong supporter and a fervent supporter of using spirituality as a means to achieve greater understanding and deep wisdom and enlightenment. And to achieve that, we also must allow the spiritual to evolve. But one thing is spiritual evolution, and another thing completely different is disregarding the historical facts and the historical truth and stick with modern assumptions that prevent actual spiritual evolution. Alright, my dear friends, thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag.